Hello listeners, Jordan here. I just want to let you know that you can listen to Nighttime early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime.
You are tuned to the Nighttime Podcast, focused on the fringe of Canada.
Welcome back to Nighttime's coverage of the disappearance of Holly Ellsworth-Clark. When we last met, we were joined by Elle, who is both Holly's employer and one of the driving forces beyond the search for her. Tonight, in the third part of this series, we're going to shift our attention to something that simply has to be addressed. That being the striking similarities between Holly's story and that of another covered on this show. The 2012 disappearance of then 26-year-old Emma Fillipoff. To me, as soon as I learned of Holly's story from the earliest news reports, it hit me like a tragic case of déjà vu. A missing young woman, an artist, who after a period of unusual behavior places a disturbing phone call home requesting a plane ticket. The police are called, they don't intervene, and before the family arrives, the young woman walks off into the cold air despite being inappropriately dressed for the weather. Perhaps I read into things too far, but that's a pretty specific series of events, and I'm not the only one who sees it that way. Within days of Holly's disappearance, I began receiving messages from listeners of the show explaining the similarities. And now that I've covered Holly's case on the show, the messages have increased substantially. This topic, the topic being the similarities between these two cases, is well worth a discussion. And that's what this episode's about. To join me in this, I've reached out to my friend Tyler Hooper, who, like me, has dove deep into Emma Fillipoff's case in the past. But before Tyler and I get to it, I just want to make a few things clear. Neither of us have any belief that Emma Fillipoff and Holly Clark's stories are specifically connected in any way. We do, however, believe that the similarities in the cases are stunning, and that many of the same factors are likely at play. Also, as we'll be discussing both cases, for those of you who don't know Emma Fillipoff's story, we will be explaining the basics to keep you up to speed and into the conversation, but there's a heck of a lot more to her story than we're going to get into here. I've done an 8-part series titled Emma Fillipoff is Missing, in which the story is told in much greater detail. So consider listening to those episodes as well. But again, it's not required that you've heard that first. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. In this episode of Nighttime, we'll be joined by freelance journalist Tyler Hooper, and our topic is the tragic coincidences shared by Holly Clark and Emma Fillipoff. So Tyler, it's been a while since you've been on the show. We last talked here, the finale of the series about Emma Fillipoff. What's been going on with you since then? I guess that's been 6 months now.
Yeah, it's been a little while. Not a whole lot. I mean, I'm working on this book proposal about this shipwreck here in BC, and that's kind of my main side project right now. It may end up also being a podcast at some point. I know you and I have talked about that a few times. I've yet to commit to it, but yeah, just working, paying the bills, and then looking for interesting projects to sink my hooks into. And when you told me about this, I was very excited that you thought of me, because I think it's a very interesting case.
Yeah, and regular listeners of the show will remember you from that episode with Emma, as well as you were on for the episode about Granger Taylor, who disappeared. For people who don't know those episodes or don't know you, tell me a little of your background.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me or haven't heard me on Jordan's podcast, for a while, I was a pretty regular feature contributor to Vice, especially Vice Canada. I haven't contributed in a while, doesn't mean I'm not going to, but I've written a lot about crime and missing persons, Emma Fillipoff, Granger Taylor, Art Williams, some names that if you Google have some pretty interesting stories. I had a documentary made about my Granger Taylor story at the CBC. My day job, I work in government, and then, I try and podcast, do documentaries, feature writing and stuff on the side. So, I consider myself a freelance writer at this point and semi-journalist, depending on what I'm writing about. But Yeah, I like stories that involve a mystery, something interesting, and any twists and turns always drags me in, like this one here. So
Yeah, so given your background, it's obvious how we became connected. So it was you did that long form piece for Vice about Emma Fillipoff's story when I was kind of in the middle of my series. So we ended up connecting, and we're like brothers from other mothers. We both have the same kind of taste in the weird stories and the mysteries. And so when I was doing this episode, this series on Holly's story, immediately I thought of you because these things were kind of coming up as I was learning more and more about Holly, that I was like, it was just really blowing my mind. And I was thinking, like, I can't wait to talk to Tyler about this. Did you know anything about Holly's story before I wrote to you? Like, did you know about this, 2 weeks ago?
no, the funny thing is when you Facebooked me asking me about this, if I knew about it, I almost immediately, I didn't know, so I went to Google it, and your next message was don't Google it. I have an episode coming out. And I had to stop myself because no, I had not heard of it. I mean, I maybe in passing through the news, but it was not something that, like, when you said the name, it stuck out to me. So it was a surprise.
Yeah, and of course, this all happened in Ontario. You're in BC. I'm in Nova Scotia. The reason I became so aware of it initially is I had earlier this year in January, right when Holly went missing, I was in the middle of like remastering and re-releasing my episodes about Emma. So people who were listening to my show were kind of tuned into that. And then I started getting these emails about, Jordan, did you hear about this case going on in Ontario? And they would give me in the email just a little blurb, like a young woman who was an artist had contacted her parents wanting a plane ticket home and then disappeared. And I'm like reading these emails being like, are these people really mixing up like what my episode's about? Or like, do they not know what's happening? And then I was like, after I got maybe 2 or 3 of those emails, I Googled her name, and as I read the article, it was like my jaw was on the floor being like, this is like the exact story that I'm covering now, and like with so many similarities. Like, what was when I told you about it and you waited and listened to my episode, at what point did you realize, the connection or the similarities this Holly story shares with Emma? Like, when did that happen during the episode?
It happened pretty early in the episode, especially when you delved into with her father about her moving to Toronto, Hamilton to kind of follow her dreams. I kind of felt like that was very similar to Emma, and that maybe Emma didn't know what dream she was following, but she was moving away to find herself a little bit. And that, to me, I mean, he'd already hinted at it and planted the seed for me, but that really, to me, right away, I was intrigued. And then obviously once we get to her living at this house and these strange circumstances and the way she disappeared, I was like, oh, this is eerily similar in a way that it's hard to ignore, I think. And I think the comparison that you're drawing is interesting, because I think that there are too many similarities to dismiss it as, oh, it's just another missing woman. It's like, no, there's something interesting going on here, for sure.
Yeah, if you plotted out, just kind of the main points of either Holly or Emma's story, they're almost interchangeable if you're not too detailed with those main points. But before we get into the similarities, I want to talk a bit about Holly's story. So you're coming in this fresh. You basically heard my 2 episodes and probably Googled a little bit about it. What are your initial thoughts? Like, what do you think's going on here?
So yeah, I listened to your episodes, but then I have to admit, after listening to the first one, I took a deep dive. So I did hit Google hard. I did hit YouTube. I was actually listening to some of her music right before we got on here.
She's really good.
She's amazing, and it's like that's my style of music that I really like too. So it was interesting. It really kind of pulled me in. Right away, what really draws me in is the frustration of there not being really a tangible lead on what happened. Like, we just know she went missing. She walked to the door around 4:00 in January. I can't remember what day it was. It was January 11th or something like that. Yeah, around there on a Saturday, I think. And then, there was some grainy footage of her walking, I think, in a garbage bag that she was obviously trying to use as like a poncho of sorts. And then a couple other unconfirmed sightings from my knowledge. And It's just so strange. Like, especially when what really stood out to me, Jordan, was when her dad, when you were interviewing him, and he was like, it's so unlike Holly to not be in touch with us. Like, why? Like, it's not uncharacteristic almost for her to be acting a little strange, because it seemed like she was having some issues and the family and friends were used to it. But for her to just completely stop communicating and to walk away like that, again, it kind of like Emma. It wasn't, she didn't communicate with her family every day. She hardly used a cell phone, but she always emailed her brother or her mom, every few weeks. And so to cut, communication off entirely with their family, that to me right away was like, something is seriously wrong. Very, very wrong with her, whether it's something happened to her or she is going through something very difficult.
With Holly's story, so she leaves the house. We have about a half hour of little sightings of her, basically walking up a main road in her area. Then she completely disappears. In Emma's story, we have the police speaking to her, and then she completely disappears. With Holly's, the events leading up to it are a little different. But do you have any main theory that you've been favoring going through this? As to what happened with what you know about it at this point?
Yeah, I mean, from what I know at this point, and this is why I kind of think I want to write an article about it, because I think there are some avenues that could be pursued pretty deeply in terms of theories. I think I agree with her dad, and obviously, I mean, her family friends know her a lot more than I do after 3 or 4 days of doing some research. But it seems like, given what I've heard and what I've read, she was definitely going through some sort of mental health issue or episode. Again, I'm convinced that's also what Emma Fillipoff was going through as well. There was a really good point, and I can't remember if this was in one of your episodes about her, but basically saying that it was with someone else. Basically saying that someone that vulnerable who might be going through something, walking around in an area like Hamilton, and actually, I've never been to Hamilton, but I did go to school in Waterloo, which is not that far away from Hamilton, and you can edit this if you want to, but the running joke from the people from Hamilton going to Waterloo was that it's called the asshole of Ontario. that was like the label that people in my class from Hamilton were giving the town in Ontario. And I'm sorry if you're from Hamilton, I'm just saying what I heard. But that, when you look into it and you look at the stats, Hamilton is a little bit of it does have a great music scene. There are some great bands. I think the Arkells are from Hamilton. And there is some great music that comes out of there, but there is also something a little edgy about that place. And I think, mixing that with someone who's in crisis, who doesn't know the area, who isn't from there, I think foul play isn't something to be ruled out, but I think the evidence so far, to answer your question, points towards her wandering off, maybe a little delusional and having a psychotic episode of some sort, and maybe trying, like her dad suggested, trying to stay hidden based on these perceived fears that she has. So that's what I'm leaning towards. But again, though, you played the episode with the last episode, and they talked about the hotel, that whole inn, and what happened there, and there maybe being some security footage deleted. Like, to me, that's worth investigating.
Yeah, wasn't that a story? That was Elle and I.
Insane.
Yeah, Elle and I in our interview, we were almost at the end, and she mentioned the inn a couple times, almost in passing, and then I was like, what happened at the inn? Because I did remember in reading like a mention. I heard a mention of it somewhere, but I never knew anything like that happened. And then Elle's like, "Oh, I'll tell you the story," and it was, again, my jaw's like on the floor, like, that happened. The way she described it, it played out in my head like a scene in a movie or something.
It was exactly like a scene in a movie, and to me, it seems like there's something suspect going on there, where randomly the hotel manager asks him to leave for a little bit and then come back, and there's footage missing. Yeah. That's weird. And I should clarify, if you are going to put in the bit about what I just said about Hamilton, I am from Ottawa, so I am an Ontario native. So nothing against places in Ontario.
It's specific to Hamilton that you have a problem with.
It's specific to Hamilton, but I also think the context is fair, because I think there are some places in Southern Ontario. I think it is a key point, like, that could be dismissed if you're not from Ontario, is that places like London and Hamilton, like any other place, but they do have a rougher side to them. And I have driven through London, especially, and Southern Ontario, and it isn't all very glamorous, and there is a lot of crime. So I think the foul play thing, especially her living so close to that was it a budget inn or whatever it was called? I mean, I think you just can't rule it out entirely. I don't know. What do you think? Are you on the same page?
Absolutely the same page. It's like, no way around the fact that she left in a vulnerable state, whether it was like a psychotic episode or, you know, something actually terrible was happening and going on in reality. Whatever happened, she left vulnerable and seemingly walked into, you know, an area with a lot of different possible threats like that. Hearing about that Budget Inn, I went on Google and I looked at pictures and stuff about it. I think it's called Budget Inn. I went and looked at pictures of it. And did you ever see the TV show The First 48? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
it seems like every episode of The First 48 is filmed like outside like that sort of place.
Did you read the reviews of the place? Because that's what I went through, the Google reviews, and it sounded like a nightmare. Like it really, So it sounded like a typical rundown place where you go for a cheap room or for nefarious activities. You know, every city has one of those places, I think.
I'm sure they do. Yeah, it's pretty inconvenient that a vulnerable young woman goes missing near one and then there's rumors created that she's in there. So I can't imagine, like, hearing that story about her mom pulling the fire alarm. It just speaks to the desperation that the parents would be feeling. Like, you would feel so crippled by the different privacy laws and policies that prevent a parent or a loved one from getting access to everything. But to be that close, to be there and, you know, to think something is going on right in front of your eyes, I can get why her mom did that. And I was like, I've never met her mom or spoke to her, but when Elle was telling that story, I was like, yes, Mom, like, you do it.
It's almost like the climax in like a movie. Like, it's like, you know, I think it was heroic to kind of do that. Like, it's like, we're not going to take this, you know, I got what, you know, Elle said too about, you know, there is bureaucracy and the police are tied, you know, they'd have to get a warrant for each room. But I mean, when you're a parent, like, again, I'm not, and you are, but I can imagine that if something happened to one of your childs and you couldn't find them, you're going to do anything you can to get some answers.
That would be like, I'd have no problem doing that, and I'm sure Holly's mom felt the same way. But it's just to hear it play out in the context of learning it. It's a story like that it gives you a taste of how desperate and intense, you know, this actually is. But yeah, I think I have similar opinions as you and similar thoughts about both cases, and really the point of the two of us meeting, and that's what we're going to get to now, is kind of compare and contrast these two stories. So both of us have a background in Emma Fillipoff's story, a missing woman from went missing in Victoria, BC. She was 26 at the time. So we both know that story very well. You wrote about it. I covered it on the podcast. Now, learning about Holly's story and the similarities that are there, it's almost like when I put out the first episode of Holly's series, immediately I was getting emails from people or comments saying, you know, that's so similar to your episodes about Emma. It's like it almost had to be addressed in the podcast. And that's what this episode will be about, is our chance for the two of us to kind of talk out some similarities of the cases and kind of cover some of the main similarities that they have. And there are tons of them. So we'll get into some of the similarities between these two cases, and we'll start with the similarities between these two young women. Looking at their personalities, I think it's easy to see Holly and Emma kind of running with the same crowd. Both seem to be very kind of whimsical, artistic type people. Holly, the musician, and you said already at the beginning, like, you've listened to some of her music. Have you ever seen any of the videos of her on stage?
Yeah, that's what I was watching on YouTube. Yeah, and she's got a powerful stage presence. Like, I mean, I know she's a tall woman, and she's like, you know, she's very strong to begin with, but like she gets into it. Like, I play guitar, and watching her play that electric, singing like that, it was kind of like a little bit toss up with like Joplin and Winehouse for me. I liked it a lot. You know, I only listened to a couple of songs. I was super into it. Yeah,
and Emma had an interest in music, but Emma's artistic personality, or that side of her, was more all encompassing. It was the, you know, painting, writing, putting together the rocks and intricate patterns and stuff, as you heard. But either way, it's like the two of them, when you look at these two women side by side, they have both kind of artistic minds, which again, it's a similarity. Another thing is both of them left home to a city that they had little connection to, that may have led to them being in a bit more of a vulnerable position. Yeah, so you can talk a bit about Emma's, and then about Emma's kind of living arrangements leading up to her disappearance, and I'll do Holly's.
Yeah, well, as far as I know about Emma, she had, I think she had moved to the Campbell River originally on Vancouver Island and then back to Ottawa. And if you want to know more about the Emma story, you can check out Jordan and I's older episode that we did about that. But, eventually she moved back to Victoria, or from Ontario back to Victoria, and bounced around. It sounded like kind of couch surfed a little bit, or maybe room surfed is a better way to put it, in friends' apartments and places, and then ended up at a woman's shelter. And then that's where she went missing. She left there and basically was never seen again. So I know you're going to talk about Holly, but I think Emma's was a bit more chaotic, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But she really seemed to not have a home when she moved to the West Coast. Like, she was on a boat at one point. People said she slept in a tree in a park. She was staying on people's couches. She did, I think, at times rent a room from friends, but she was definitely very much a nomad, I think, when she moved out to Vancouver Island, which in all fairness, for context, is a lifestyle out here. Vancouver Island does have a very hippie sort of vibe to it in parts. And so it definitely wouldn't be as weird as if you were to do that in like Ottawa, where I'm from. That's very government and, just a bit more uptight, and the seasons are a bit more drastic as well. So, yeah,
Emma definitely had the transient kind of thing happening. But one thing is, so Holly, her situation was she moved to Hamilton basically to be with a guy that she had connections to. That didn't work out, but for whatever reason, she stayed in the city and seemed to have very little connection with anyone. Like, she had the one guy who, as Elle said, broke her heart. And then it seemed like she was just kind of trying to put herself out there, maybe trying to get a job where she would be in a position to meet people, or playing at open mics and basically like introducing herself to people on stage, like, I'm new to the city. Emma had some friends in Victoria, but she was still seemed to be like, a lot of the people she was close to were people she met in Victoria. So it was kind of like, I don't know, like, I'm sure you can relate to this, and anyone who listens can. Is kind of like a new friend that you meet at this point of your life is kind of like one thing, and they know this certain side of you. But like a long-term friend, it's just different. And so if you're surrounded by people who just know your current state, it's just a different kind of context to exist in than when you're with your friends from high school. Yeah, I don't know. I just feel like both of them were in a position where they would have been surrounded by people who were really accepting of them to just go their own way, because, that's how the context that they would know them in. And I just think, like, I don't know how big of a role that plays in this story, in their stories, but it's just a big similarity that both of them had this living arrangement going on.
Yeah, I think too, like, that's a great point. I also think, because I'm from Ottawa. I moved to the West Coast 5-6 years ago on my own. I knew no one in Vancouver except one person I went to school with in grade 8. I came out, in my mid-20s for adventure, and I stayed because I've loved it. But it is, I will say, from my own experience, and then, having read and listened to Emma's case and now Holly's, it is a very vulnerable, lonely experience at times. Like, I still now, like, yeah, I miss my family a lot, and it's not easy, I guess, is what I'm saying. So I guess I can really sympathize with a move that drastic, especially because from what I understand too, this is important to note, both of them were relatively close to their families. My personal opinion is that I think Emma probably, like any family, probably had some issues with family members, and there was some dynamics there that we'll never understand, because that's what family is. And I'm sure the same is with Holly, but I think there was still a lot of love there. And I don't think they were running from something that was like very extreme. So I think that's important to note, because when you make a decision like that to move away from people you care about and you love and that you're close to, I think it very quickly becomes evident how lonely you can be. And I think that is a similarity I see with both of these cases, is that These two people were following their own paths or their own journeys or their own dreams. But sometimes part of that is experiencing being alone. And like you said, meeting very casual friends and people who maybe don't really care about you that much because they've just met you. They haven't known you their whole life. And they probably, everyone as they get older has their own things going on. So I think you get empathetically a little less for people. So I think that's important to note too, because I think it is harder to form deeper bonds with strangers the older you get. There's obviously exceptions, of course, but it's not like when you're kids and, everyone you meet becomes your best friend. And then, you grow up with those people. It's a different time in your life for sure.
Now, the next thing, the two stories are different in this way, but it happens in both of them, is the idea of kind of the paranoid behavior kind of kicking in leading up to their disappearance. In Emma's case, we have a longer history of it. It seemed like her decline, if there was a decline into something, it seemed to be more gradual and become more extreme. In Holly's case, it seemed to start out of nowhere. As far as her father told me, it was like the day before she disappeared, she had some loneliness and whatnot and sadness with this breakup, but it was like the day before she disappeared is when things turned on. In Emma's case, we can go back quite a bit further, but looking at kind of the trajectory that leads to the moment of their disappearances, both of them have similar paranoid behavior. In Emma's case, she had apparently wrote about being stalked or followed. Holly straight up called her parents and described it. But it's a very similar story.
You're right. I think Emma's there from what we know. And again, a good point too is, Holly only went missing a few months ago. Emma's been missing for a few years. So we know more about Emma's story and case because of that. And maybe, I hope Holly is found and we don't have to learn more about her past. But I think, Emma seemed to be it was almost like as you trace her pattern of the last few years before she went missing, there becomes a lot of evidence to say that she was battling something to do with mental health. With Holly, it definitely seemed more sudden. I think, the last guest you had basically said like her journals suddenly changed within a couple days of her going missing. And I think, that's a sign of something very sudden coming on. But again, her dad did allude to her having a really bad panic and anxiety attack.
Like a year prior, she thought her roommate was like poisoning her and stuff. And so something's up.
Yeah, something's up. And I think that's definitely a similarity between the two of them. Neither of us are psychologists or mental health experts. But I think it's fair to say that there was something going on with both of them. And as much as it seems like Holly's was sudden, I also got the impression, though, that maybe she had also had some issues along the way, but maybe didn't know quite what was going on. And again, with Emma, it's like we've had a lot more time to study that case and her background. But I do feel like they both had something amiss.
Yeah, and a good point where a lot more time has passed with Emma's story. So more people had a chance to come out and share their experiences with her leading up to that. And who's to say with Holly's story that there isn't encounters people had in the days before that maybe would give more information, and that just hasn't come out yet. But the next kind of big kind of touch point in this, and this is one detail of the two stories that I find is really eerily similar, is the odd phone call to the parents specifically asking for a plane ticket or come and get me and help get me on a plane. Like both Emma made the series of calls to her mom where she would back and forth between get me a plane ticket, don't get me a plane ticket, come and help me, don't come and help me. Holly, we get to hear that phone call because she left a voicemail, and in the episode I played it, but it was when I heard Holly's dad describe it to me, it was the same situation as Emma's. It was, she wanted to come, but she needed help getting there. And, and they thought maybe she wasn't in the state to even get on the plane. Like, it's just, it makes me think how often are those calls made, and like how, for the two stories to be that similar and have that kind of key phone call right before they disappeared is really odd. And not only that, is like Shelley arrived in Victoria like hours after Emma disappeared. Holly's dad arrived like the next day. It's just really freaky that that phone call set something in motion the exact same way in both of these stories.
Yeah, it's almost like the final red flag, you know, it's like that something is wrong, you know, and that's when I think that's when Shelley knew with Emma, and that's when Holly's parents knew, like that phone call, like you listen to that voicemail and it's eerie. Like when I listen to it, like it is eerie. It is interesting too, you know, again, not to psychoanalyze too much, but it is interesting that she starts it off so distraught. And then by the end, she's almost, I mean, she's not completely recovered, but she's definitely composed herself a lot more. And to me, that's someone who's fluctuating in emotions and feelings very quickly. You know what I mean? Did you get that vibe too?
Absolutely. That was one of the first things I noticed. She went from like breaking down, defeated, crying.
Completely distraught.
And it seemed like with the drop of a hat, her tone changed and she's like, okay, not that she was up high or anything in terms of mood, but she was definitely, I can't think of a time I've ever encountered something in person where someone changed mood that quick. Although I say that, I think of lots of times with my kids that I manage to pull them out of it, but usually when I get them out of their, you know, whatever's bothering them, they're still kind of sobbing, and it seemed like it was like a switch changed with her, which is really weird.
Yeah, so the pause was interesting to me, and the shift of tone in the call, because you like you said, it is really different and unique, and it's not something I've ever heard someone really do. Again, though, right away, and again, I'm not a mental health expert, I don't know, but when I heard that, I immediately thought this is someone who is going through something emotionally and mentally that is extreme. It's intense, and to go from that distraught kind of like basically like sounded like they're fearing for their life at the beginning of the call, to going to like, hey, well, I love you, I hope to talk to you soon, to kind of like being more composed, it was very strange to me. And I think that does speak to probably what's in her journal, and probably whatever other people have seen from her behavior the last couple of days, is that, you know, she probably was battling something and trying to, if you don't know what it is, it's a really scary thing. So I can imagine your emotions are all over the place. And honestly, it sounds like Emma was kind of the same way the few days before she disappeared. Like, she had moments where, you know, she looked very sullen and sad, but then had these like manic moments where she was like pushing furniture outside and almost being kind of aggressive. Like, it sounded like her emotions were also kind of all over the place. So to me, that speaks of some sort of crisis of the mind and of mental health, you know?
And then when we think of someone who's struggling and at risk in some way, we often think, hopefully the police can come and help them. Oddly, in both of these cases, right at the last minute, the police were there, and it didn't help them. Maybe you can talk about how the police were, or what we know about the police's involvement with Emma's story, and we'll compare it with Holly's.
Yeah, so from what I understand, the police from Emma's story, she was walking around downtown near the Empress Hotel, and a friend or acquaintance, probably more of an acquaintance, showed up named Dennis Quay. And he noticed that Emma wasn't wearing shoes, and she didn't look particularly well. There's not a lot of details because, as far as I know, Dennis hasn't done really any or very few interviews. But she was basically, he was concerned enough to call the police to check on her well-being. So I think at one point he made some sort of excuse and stepped off and stepped into a restaurant, used their phone, and called the police. They showed up somewhere downtown and right in front of the Empress, right on the water. Talked to Emma, from what I understand, for about 40 minutes or so, and then basically decided that she wasn't a risk to herself or others, and took off. And then, of course, there's people maybe saw Emma again later that night or later the next morning, but really that's the last real confirmed sighting we have of Emma Fillipoff. From what, you know, and you made a good point about this on your show about Emma, a lot of people right away would say, well, the police should have done more. They have a set of rules and procedures they have to go through when people are in crisis like that. And if they don't deem them to be a threat to themselves or others, there's not a lot they can do. And I think if the police spent 40 minutes with Emma, They probably did their due diligence. We're probably trying really hard to get her to admit she needed to go to a hospital or something, but just couldn't do it. They can't just put her in the back of a police car and drive away. That's not, that's infringing on. No, it's infringing on her civil liberties and a lot of other things, right? I'm not an expert of the law either, but there is a process they have to go through, and I know you've done an episode kind of clearing that up a little bit because it is a bit of a misnomer. But yeah, that's basically the circumstances. The cops talked to Emma for about 40 minutes, decided, she wasn't obviously okay, but she wasn't harmed herself or others, so they had to move on. They had to go do their job somewhere else, basically.
Yeah. And with Holly's case, a very similar story. We heard Holly's dad describe how after those calls were made, Holly's dad or Holly's parents sent both her brother and her sister separately to check on her. Neither were able to even get in her room to talk to her. Her brother phoned 911, reporting her as being in distress. And the police come, and the way Dave, Holly's dad, described it is they didn't get in her room either. They spoke to her through the door of her bedroom and asked her questions like, are you going to hurt yourself? Are you going to harm someone else? Just those kind of, I'm sure a lot of the same questions Emma was asked. And Holly answered them in such a way that either they felt genuinely that she was okay, or they didn't have enough to kick the door down and take her to a hospital or something, somewhere, one or the other. But needless to say, 911 was called, the police responded, asked her enough questions that led to them leaving her there. In Holly's case, it was the next morning she disappeared. In Emma's case, she wasn't seen again, confirmed sighting of after that interaction with the police. But it's just when you're going through these tragic stories of all these odd things happening, ending in a disappearance. In both of these stories, we have the police dropped in at this pivotal moment, but it's just not enough to change the course of what appears to be the tragedy in both of the stories, or if not tragedy, something very unusual. The police procedure wasn't able to stop it in either case, which is just very... It's surprising, but it also makes me question how these kind of mental health calls are handled. If there's these two stories that are this similar, in either case, the police weren't able to change the course of the event. It's kind of dark.
Well, and these are the two you and I are able to connect. I'm sure maybe you're going to get emails after this saying of a third, fourth case that is eerily similar. Like maybe it is a thing where, maybe the police do, they have challenges when addressing what to do when someone's in a mental health crisis. I mean, they're there to enforce and protect, but what do you do to help someone who doesn't even really know what's going on with them, but isn't a threat to anyone else? It's a precarious situation.
Absolutely. In hindsight, it's 2020, and you can't go around arresting people because they're acting strange or weird. We have although it's not in Canada, but in the United States right now, there's people protesting because the government's declared a state of emergency and wants people to not open their businesses, and people are protesting. Imagine if you're going around arresting them because they're barefoot and expressing themselves in odd ways. So it's it is such a slippery, delicate slope, and that's why I think it's almost like there needs to be a different kind of division beyond police that handle this, because a police officer, although there's different types with different levels of training or whatever, to meet with an Emma Fillipoff or a Holly Clark in the midst of what appears to be some kind of crisis, and to have the skills to handle that is a lot different than what you would need to break up fights outside of the bar and arrest shoplifters. And it's such a distance away from a lot of other police activities to be able to be a master of these delicate environments. So I get the complicated nature of the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
So now the next thing that we'll talk about is there's so many. As I go through it, I have a list of similarities that goes on and on. We don't need to talk about this, but oddly enough, both of them were carrying garbage bags right around the time of their disappearance. So we heard of Emma having garbage bags and like kind of like bags over her shoulders and so like shopping bags and stuff. Holly, we don't even need to hear about it. We have video of Holly walking first wearing a garbage bag like a poncho, then a couple minutes later wearing a garbage bag as a poncho with another garbage bag over her shoulder that looks to be half full of things. Then a couple minutes later, she's seen again in video wearing the garbage bag as a poncho without the garbage bag of stuff over her shoulder. And that could all be red herrings, but it just makes me think like, you know, whether we're talking about Holly or Emma, I'm thinking like, what the heck did they have with them? Maybe it was they were in some kind of delusional state where maybe it was just a bag of garbage. But it still begs the question, like, what was?
Yeah, it sounds
could that be a clue or?
Yeah, it could be. Like, it sounds like in both cases, I got the impression that it was maybe like a few personal belongings and a couple elements of clothing. But I mean, again, with Holly though, I think she only took her wallet, right? Like she left her phone.
Yeah,
at her room,
and she was.
Yeah, she didn't take anything else.
Yeah, there was photos of her leaving her apartment. She didn't have anything. So
yeah, so she got the bag from somewhere else. So yeah, that's very
like,
strange.
Yeah, it's like what the heck is that? And just a weird coincidence between the two.
It is.
Also, I don't know many people who keep a journal. Both Emma and Holly kept a journal that appears to give some indication of a decline or crisis or whatnot. We've talked about Emma's a lot in my episodes, but we've heard it described as like kind of a mix between a narrative and creative writing and poetry. Holly's, we didn't get too into it, but it seems to be like I'm picturing a lot of the same kind of stuff. What Elle had described to me about Holly's journals was not only was what she writing seeming to get forth like some kind of a decline, but even the way she was writing seemed to be kind of a little more disorganized or whatnot. But it's just, in both of these stories, there's a journal there, which is, for anyone who, if you're someone who likes a mystery, adding a journal to a mystery, it just opens up these other layers or something. So it almost feels like if Agatha Christie wrote a missing persons case, there would be a journal left behind.
Yeah, and it is, I think, a reflection of both of them being artists, you know, and being expressionists and wanting to write their feelings or doings down, whether or not they wanted people to see it. But it is really interesting. Yeah, I think that with the garbage bags, like, again, could be just red herrings. I mean, the one thing about the journals I think that is really valuable, though, is you do get an insight into something happening before they go missing. In Holly's case especially, it sounds like something deteriorated, like her actual handwriting was affected by the way she was feeling. So that's got to tell you something about her mental state. You know, Emma's, again, you know, she has an entry that a lot of people have thought could have been a suicide note, which a lot of people said no, it's just her way of being creative and exploring really heavy topics. So the journal is the journals of both of them is very interesting. Yeah.
And it also frees up, like, I didn't know about this concept until recently, but there's a concept called I think it's called a psychological autopsy. And it's after, it's like interviewing people and looking at evidence of someone's behavior and personality and trying to diagnose them after the fact. And we had the tragedy in Nova Scotia a few weeks ago with the mass shooting. And there's now, it's the RCMP have announced that they are having a psychological autopsy done on the shooter or the gunman or whatever you want to call him to try to figure out maybe what a part of his motivation was. I'm just thinking if you wanted to get in the head of either of these, but like with a professional, having that journal there is where it's personal writings to themselves must be like a gold mine of information to someone with a background in that. But
absolutely.
But then again, then that begs the question though, like, would that even bring you any closer to finding them? So it's, you know, all these things with a missing persons case, especially one with the layers as either of these stories do, is everything we're talking about could be red herrings that are completely irrelevant to the one fact that will answer the question as to what happened. But it's still, you know, you kind of have to look at everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, the next thing we talked a bit about the area where Holly was living, Hamilton, maybe being a little spot that was rough around the edges. But just to compare or however you want to pull. You so eloquently refer to it as the
asshole.
asshole.
You said it much better. You said it much better than I did.
My mom
yes.
listens to this, man. But one thing that both areas have in common. So Emma disappeared in Victoria, last seen outside the Empress Hotel, which if you go on Google Maps and look at where she was basically at the harbor. Like she was looking.
Oh, the inner harbor's
she was
right there.
in the water, like right at the water. In Holly's case, also disappeared in an urban area. Hamilton's a city. She was walking the direction that she was walking. If you're on Google Maps and you look at the street she was on and the way she was walking, you just have to zoom out a little bit and you see water. It's just, to me, it's if you were going to make a movie of either of these stories, they could be put in the same kind of setting, like an urban city on the water, you know, on a cold, rainy night. It's just so strange.
Well, there's another, the weather.
Yeah.
The weather was eerily similar as well. Like a little bit of rain. It was probably a little colder in Hamilton in January, but I think that's a factor that can't be ignored. And honestly, when you gave me this list of similarities that you wanted to talk about, that was the one I circled, because I still think in Emma's case, especially, whether she escaped and left and went somewhere else by water, or she unfortunately met her demise in water, I think it has something to do with it. It's too hard. It's such an easy way to vanish one way or the other. I mean, especially the Pacific Ocean. Like you know, whether you're on a boat or you try and swim or whatever it is, I think it's a factor. And I think when you brought that up, and then when I mapped the budget in on Google Maps today, and I looked at how close Lake Ontario is to, I didn't realize that it was that close to where this happened. And I was like, that's a factor. I mean, who knows how much of it is, but I think it's hard to ignore.
And the same with Emma's, like she was right there. But that said, both of these women, Holly and Emma, although disappearing in an urban area near water, both of them made a habit of leaving the urban area to explore the rural area. So Emma did these long walks through outside of the city. Holly did these long bike rides where she would kind of explore the wilderness outside of Hamilton. So both of them, although disappearing in that scenario, weren't scared to travel off outside of the city and get into the woods. So it just kind of broadens the area you would want to search and broadens the possibilities of where they may be and what may have happened. But again, just the similarities is just so weird.
It is weird. It's very strange.
Mm-hmm. Now, looking back on it, or looking at both of these stories from our present point of view, we have a lot of the same information, a lot of the same possibilities. One thing that I find eerily similar, when I was talking to both Holly's dad and Elle, the volunteer who's helping them, what reminded me so much of Emma's story is so many of the leads that they're getting and tips that they're getting are these vague sightings of quasi-homeless people who may or may not look like Holly or Emma, and those leads being fruitful, like being something like what's kind of driving the search now is reacting to these tips and leads. I just felt like both stories are kind of at the same point where there's very little new concrete information that would make you jump in one direction or another. Instead, it's, I think I saw her at this place, so we go search and hang posters there. It's just, when I was talking to Elle and Dave, I was just, so much of me was like, you're thinking like that it's exactly where Emma's story has been for so long now as far as the search.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's very eerie how many similarities they are based on the sightings. One thing that I thought was interesting, though, and I know you're trying to go for similarities here, but one discrepancy, and maybe this is something we just don't know about, but I thought it was interesting that Holly's family was talking so much about getting ransom calls. That was weird to me, because I was like, I don't recall that happening with Fillipoff. I mean, maybe it did, and maybe Shelley didn't want to share it, or, and I understand why there are a lot of crackpots out there, like trying to, get attention, but it was really strange, because I remember when you even asked me, like, oh, this is a one-off. He's like, no, this has happened 3 times already. And I was like, that's really strange to me. And that was really interesting. You know,
I just wonder,
that struck a nerve.
Yeah, I just wonder if there are people out there, like just like thinking like how evil this would be if there's people out there who search for missing persons cases and write ransom notes trying to get some money out of these people. Like if, there's all sorts of scams going on of like, that prey on the elderly or prey on the vulnerable in one way or another. I got a bunch of emails where it was like, it was pretending to be from a drugstore that was offering like, medicine related to the coronavirus and stuff. And I'm just thinking like, you pricks, like to take advantage of this. But as awful as it would be,
I thought your mom listened to this. What are you doing?
Pricks isn't that bad. But as awful as it would be to prey on people terrified of the coronavirus, it would be so much worse to write to tip lines dedicated to a certain missing persons case and try to get $500 to get a photo of their missing loved one. Like to me,
it's disgusting. It's disgusting.
Yeah. And if it happened to them 3 times and they're willing to tell me that, I'm bet you it probably happens to a lot of these stories, especially the well-known ones like Emma's or Ryan Stuka's. Maybe their families aren't out there saying it. I don't know. But if it happened to them 3 times, that seems a little weird.
Can I ask you one question going back to the similarities? Because like you said, there are, and sorry for that tangent, but there are, like you said, a lot of weird similarities of there being video clips of these 2 people before they completely vanish. What did you think? Because I remember we talked about what we thought when we saw Emma and the 7-Eleven. What did you think of and I'm talking about the confirmed clip of Holly where she's wearing the garbage bag as like a kind of like a poncho. What do you think of that clip when you see her walking like that? I know it's brief and not a lot happens, but what did you think when you saw that?
I watched it a bunch of times. For one, she did have a very distinct gait, like the way she walked. It was kind of like the sort of like limpy shuffle kind of thing, which would make it easier to identify her in other video when there's these sightings come up or whatever. And she's also very tall. And like in the video, she's a large person with a distinct walk.
Very much so. She
seems to really be like on a mission. Like she looks, if I saw her, I would think this is someone who's like has somewhere they got to get.
That's why I asked you. That's the first thing I thought.
Like she looks to me as someone who has to get somewhere and isn't. She's got something going on in her head that she's either late or she's worrying about something. Like she looks,
she's stomping towards something. Like I was like, she looks like she almost looked upset, like angry in the video. And I was like, that's the one difference again from Emma is you see the videos of Emma, she's much more timid, looking at the window, making sure people aren't following her. It's like, Holly's like, I mean, again, maybe she could just want me to get out of the rain. Like who could blame her? It looks like it's pouring in the video, but I'm glad you noticed that too. Cause I was like, I very much thought she was striving towards something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And it's, if I was walking down a sidewalk and she passed by me walking and carrying the bag and stuff, I would assume she had something in there that she just had to get it. So like I would think like maybe she's, carrying something of value to a friend's house and she's trying to get there quick or something, but she does seem like she's doing something.
Yeah. You know what the feeling I get now that we've talked about Holly and I've gone down that hole and I spent a lot of time researching Emma's case. Feel like it's nags at me, but something's missing. I feel like we're always missing something despite all the information that we have that almost could kind of, and I think that's probably how the family and friends feel too, to kind of lock this all together for it to make sense. And that to me is kind of my takeaway. It nags at you and it nags at me. Like, I don't know what it is or if it's an interview or someone we need to talk to or a detail or something we're overlooking or underlooking. But it does feel like with these 2 cases, there is something that we are inherently missing in the timeline or whatever that doesn't make either of these disappearances make a lot of sense. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. And I find that applies not only to a missing persons case, but to most mysteries. At the end of it, at the end of the day, you have kind of like using the analogy of like a puzzle. You have a collection of puzzle pieces, none of which fit together in any logical way. and you don't know if you even have all of the pieces. So at the end of it, you just have these random puzzle pieces on the floor that may not even be for the same puzzle. And that's kind of the way I see both of these stories. You have these different facts, but the all of those facts put together don't create one obvious thing. There's either not enough. Some of the facts may have nothing to do with what we're looking at. Yeah, I think something's missing. I think that's what makes a missing persons case something that can capture the public's attention the way it does, both because of the tragedy and the empathy we have for the families and the need to put resolution to this, heartbreak that's going on. But the public, especially getting into like these online sleuth kind of communities, both of which these cases, Emma's and Holly's, have a bunch of people online theorizing and speculating. It just, the mystery and whether or not all the puzzle pieces are on the floor really fuels a lot of conversation.
Absolutely. Well said.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have one last thing that I want to end with, and I'm not ending with it because I think this is the answer to the whole mystery or any grand kind of finale. It's just something that came my way right before we started planning to get together and chat, and it just struck a nerve with me, and I thought this clip of audio is important. This is so on my website, there's a spot where you can contact me, and you can write an email. It has links to my Facebook and YouTube and all that stuff, but it also has a spot where you can send me a voice memo, and randomly, like where on your phone, you can just record a memo and it'll email it to me, and I can record my voice and write back. I just randomly got an email from somebody or a voice memo from somebody who listened to the episodes about Holly, and they wrote to me sharing their opinion on maybe what was going on with both of these women. And it just so happened that while you and I were planning to do this episode, I got this voice memo that was also comparing and contrasting the two cases. The guy who sent me the voicemail, his name is Peter Junker, and he is a listener of the show. He's also an author. He wrote a book called Things Will Get Worse. And what makes Peter unique and what makes his comments so important is he suffers from bipolar disorder. In fact, his book, Things Will Get Worse, it's a book of poetry where a lot of it is about kind of like life and living with bipolar disorder. And he decided to express himself in poem. But anyway, he sends me a voicemail discussing these two women from his point of view. So let's listen to it, then we'll chat it out a bit.
Okay.
Hi, Jordan. There was a lot of speculation that mental illness was involved in Emma's and Holly's disappearances, and based on my own experience, it seems very clear that there was mental illness involved. The question came up, I think, in both discussions about whether there was some kind of schizophrenia going on, and I want to suggest that there is a whole different category of mental health, mental illness that can exhibit itself in a psychotic event, which is bipolar mania. People think they know about the pendulum of moods, that things swing back and forth, but folks don't know the finer points of bipolar disorder. In my own case, I had my first signs of bipolar mania and psychosis at age 16, but I wasn't diagnosed until 29 or 30. And I just think some aspects of the women's stories sound like bipolar disorder to me. The mysterious disappearances of the women were preceded in both cases by mysterious behavior, things that were out of character or at least unusual. They both had very emotional conversations with their parents in the days before. In Emma's case, her shoelessness struck me, from my experience again, as a kind of sprightly euphoria That's on the high end of hypomania. And in Holly's case, it seems like there was some sort of bipolar psychosis going on. In my own experience with bipolar psychosis, I had a couple of events. One of them was I was in a disturbed emotional state, and it was like there was a mob outside my house ready to come and grab me. Now that sounds to me a lot like Holly's conviction that two men were following her around and her kind of paranoia. And again, the way that Holly and Emma were behaving before their disappearances just feels to me like there could have been some bipolar disorder. Now, I think that's especially true in Holly's case. The fact that Emma was residing in a homeless shelter for a number of days suggests something more long-term to me than just a case of bipolar mania. Again, I can't diagnose anybody, but based on my own experience, I can imagine myself acting very much like Emma and Holly before their disappearances. What makes me think that they might be suffering from bipolar disorder? A few things. One is the fact that they were highly accomplished and focused when they were young. It doesn't become a problem until it becomes more malignant, which is why it tends to come out in young adulthood with the stresses of adulthood and maybe just the development of the disease. The other reason is that both Emma and Holly were extremely creative types, and artistic people with artistic ability and personalities, are actually demonstrably overrepresented in the number of people with bipolar disorder. And finally, the worst case scenario, I think, that there may have been some foul play involved, I wonder about, because when you're in a disturbed emotional state like that, you, two things. First of all, it calls attention to yourself from other people that you are unstable. And secondly, it just messes up your decision making. And both those things really increase your chances of becoming a victim. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. I hope it adds something to the conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, I think Peter, at least in my opinion, Peter makes a lot of good points there.
Yeah, I really think he does. I think it's really interesting. He sounds like he has a lot of firsthand experience with it, and everything he says, when I listen to that, I was nodding the entire time. Like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, like there's it does fill in a lot of gaps for me. It's interesting. It's also kind of sad too to hear Peter talk about that and to hear, to hear that.
And I didn't know a lot. Like I guess I know what the average person would about bipolar disorder, the idea of the big mood swings between like depression and, the super excited mania or whatever kind of thing. But hearing, like after listening to him and being kind of just like you described, nodding along, like, yep. I went and Googled, did a bit of research on it, and yeah, just the more I read, the more I guess I wish I had known more about bipolar before this, because it does. I don't know, the more I learn about it and think about these cases, the more I think it could possibly have been something that was happening. Again, I'm no expert on it, but he knows what he's talking about, I can tell, and he just made a lot of good points. And it just, even just now listening to him describe that, I thought back of what we were talking about earlier with her voicemail, where she was really swinging. Mm-hmm. Talking about Holly, she was really swinging between just like grief and kind of this frantic, like distraught kind of tone at the beginning, and then all of a sudden swinging to a completely different mood towards the end of that phone call. And it just, I don't know, he could be right. And he also described at the end where, whether or not the mental illness or the psychosis or whatnot is what causes the problem, it definitely will put you in a vulnerable position if, Emma's shoeless, disoriented, walking around downtown, or Holly's carrying around a garbage bag, dressed in a garbage bag, roaming around town. It's if there's someone out there looking to do harm to an attractive young woman, these two will make it known that they're, or appear to be making it known that they're in a vulnerable state.
Yeah, and to me, the few things I do know about bipolar or bipolarity is that, it tends to, people who do have it tend to be drawn to the arts. I mean, there's a lot of artists like Jimi Hendrix. I think there's rumors that John Lennon might have had it. Like, there's a lot of people who are very creative who suffer from that disorder. And also, I do know that a lot of people don't get diagnosed with it until a little later in their sort of young, adulthood. So like late 20s, early 30s. So, I mean, to me,
the exact age these two artistic people
27,
were.
right? Like, and I mean, both of them were undoubtedly creative, a little different and eccentric in their own ways. So yeah, when basically just, reiterating what you were saying, what Peter was saying, it makes a lot of sense. And, but the thing is, it doesn't answer the questions, what happened. It's just maybe a catalyst for what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Or it's maybe another one of the puzzle pieces on the floor. But yeah, it's just, it's sad. These stories are tragic and sad. I think, especially so in Holly's, it's so like this, when we talk about Emma, we're talking about something that happened years ago. The trail is growing colder every day, and it's harder to get new leads. In Holly's case, we're talking about a disappearance 5 months ago. So it's, when the pandemic's over, I'm sure her friends and family are going to be in Hamilton beating the streets again, looking for any trace of her. And I do think that there's a high potential of, something happening this summer, locating her, or at least answering the question as to what happened.
Yeah, and I really hope so too, that, they don't have to keep waiting for an answer like Emma Fillipoff's family is doing. That's a long, painful road. So it would be nice to get some sort of closure or answer. But one thing I did want to say was that, I hope the people that listen to this episode, that if any of them did live with Holly, or in the same house, and know more than maybe they're afraid to tell people about, or they think they have anything that might be useful, now is not the time to be embarrassed or to be unsure. Like, you should be telling at the very least the police, what so that we can, people can, the family and everyone else can figure out what happened to Holly and where she is. I got a big, this from the what was alluded to in the last couple of interviews you did, that the people who lived with Holly last maybe not have been being super helpful. And obviously I'm not privy to the situation, but I would just say that, like, regardless of what's going on, now is the time to say and reveal whatever because who knows? Like we've talked about so many times with these cases, Jordan, you don't know what little detail is going to break these things wide open. So anything is relevant. And to me, this almost reminds me of like Dennis Quaye. Like, the last people to see her alive, or not missing anyways, we don't know if Holly's not alive, was her roommates. And, Dennis Quaye, he has chosen not to speak out, and that's totally fine. And I hope he's spoken out to the right people if he has. But I just kind of think of the same thing in this moment. I'm like, the last people to see someone before they go missing are the most important. And I just hope they know that, whatever minute detail I think is not important, it very well could be.
Yeah, I would love to talk to them. I would love to hear from someone who is living in that home, just to get a sense. Like, it's one thing to hear Holly's dad or Elle talk about it, but I'd love to hear from someone who was there, who can better explain what was going on. I hope to be able to do that in a future episode, but I would much rather them contact the police and tell them everything they know.
Yeah,
if they know anything.
Yeah, exactly. And I would still love to hear one of them on your show. That's kind of why I brought it up. It was call to action. I was like, yeah, I would love for you to talk to one of them. So hopefully that happens.
Yeah. Well, hopefully the cases are solved and we don't have to do further. And the follow-up episode can be Holly.
That's a good point.
Talking about all the great adventures she's had the last few months with us on the show. But Either way, Tyler, I'm glad to have you on to talk this stuff out, because this was good. This is a conversation that wouldn't have been appropriate or comfortable with someone as close to the story as Dave or Elle, but for people who are interested in the story, listening to us talk has hopefully created a bunch of new rabbit holes and ideas for them to look into. But again, it's always awesome to have you on the show, so I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, thank you, Jordan. I always appreciate and love coming on, so thank you.
I want to thank you for joining Tyler and I in our discussion surrounding the tragic coincidences shared by Holly Clark and Emma Fillipoff. Although our conversation focused on the similarity, these are two very different women with their own unique and important lives. In my experience, after meeting members of both Holly and Emma's families, the most striking similarity between the two, and certainly the most important one, is that they are incredibly loved by a family who desperately wants them back. And with that, we'll end this episode of Nighttime. Now, before we part, I want to end with thanks. First, a huge thank you to Tyler for again taking the time to join the show as co-host. Also, a big thanks to the Canadian band Paragon Cause, who provide the musical theme for this episode. And lastly, but most importantly, a huge thank you to the listeners of Nighttime. Without you, this show would have seen the light of day many moons ago. And with that said, if you want more Nighttime, let me suggest the premium feed. For about the price of a cup of coffee, you can access a separate feed in which the episodes are posted earlier than in the free feed, and are done so without paid advertising. But beyond the regular episodes, the premium feed also includes the Nightcap Aftershow episodes in which I and a guest climb a bit deeper down the rabbit hole. You can access the premium feed at patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. For anyone else who'd like to support the show but can't help financially, you can give me a big hand by simply telling your friends about me and leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whichever equivalent you're using. If any of you listening want to stay up to date with my activities on or off the show, follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I use the handle @NighttimePod. If you have any story ideas or want to give feedback on the show, I'd love to hear from you at nighttimepodcast@gmail.com. Now, until next time, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and keep your eyes open for Holly Clark and Emma Fillipoff.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte. Copyright Jordan Bonaparte.